Hello, my name is Sirek. I'm an internist endocrinologist and also a theologian with a PhD in Thomas Aquinas on the sensory physical nature. I have a deep spiritual life, and in cooperation with the parish of Muskoka Lakes, we are establishing this blog space for matters of spiritual interest. Our first session is on getting in touch with my personal spiritual space. We begin with some questions. What do we mean by the human spirit? Who does my very own spirit look like? Where is the spiritual space? How can I get to know my unique spirit and its special space? The answers to these kinds of questions do not come from the usual way we approach things. These are the kind of things that one cannot figure out. There's no cause and effect equation that yields up a solution or a fix. These are the kinds of things, these are the kinds of questions that take us into the realm of storytelling. When we use storied thinking, we're not trying to prove a point. Stories allow us to experience a personal gut resonance with the storyteller's experience. Here's a little story about a boy and his dog by a certain B.B. Simon. I will use this story to illustrate what we mean by the human spirit and its dynamic interior space. Once upon a time, there was a little boy who had a dog. The boy and the dog were inseparable companions. They loved each other very much. But one day, the dog did something that the boy's parents didn't like. Because the boy needed to please his parents, he sent the dog away, saying, "You're not my dog anymore." Many years passed, and the boy forgot he ever had a dog. But inside him, he felt a place of emptiness. So he went on a journey, following that feeling of emptiness, and eventually he found himself on the edge of a woods. He sat there waiting, and waiting. Then in time, peeping out of the woods, he saw two eyes, and he waited again. Then out of the woods came a nose, and he still waited. And then out of the woods came a creature, slinking, muddy, covered with burrs, scars, and wounds. The little creature was so skinny that you wouldn't know it was a dog. Slowly, it crept closer to him, but not too close, just a little closer. The boy sat there, just being with the dog, just waiting. When the time was right, he asked, "How are you? Tell me about yourself." And so the dog told him about the years in exile, and about how it hurt when it was sent away, and how it had lived in loneliness all these years. The boy listened carefully until the whole story was complete. And then they were able to live together again. When the boy began to live with the boy again, when the boy and the dog began to live together again, it became happy. The dog became happy, well-fed, and strong, and friendly. So what has this story to do with the human spirit? The spirit of a human being is the part that feels and senses whatever's going on out there. The spirit is like that faithful pup that looks deeply into your eyes when you're sad or romps with you when you're happy. The human spirit senses happy, sad, scared, angry, etc. Moreover, the human spirit knows what contributes to flourishing and what hinders, similar to the way that an animal knows its predator. The self inclines towards well-being on account of the human spirit that moves it to do so. What's more, the spirit is what steers the self out of harm's way. The spirit, with its capacity to sense whatever's going on, also responds to whatever's going on. When we say that the spirit responds, we mean that a certain kind of movement arises. The spirit moves the self so as to avoid harm and destruction, and at the same time it advances the self towards ever-increasing aliveness. The spirit alive is how a self, a personal, sensing, feeling self, comes to be fully alive. Sometimes the spirit becomes dampened because some parts of the self are in exile, banished like the little dog, condemned to a state of being unnoticed, unseen, unheard, no longer free to feel or to respond. They are the lost parts, perhaps those parts that we're ashamed of, parts that do not fit with the identity that we want to project out there. No one wants to be seen as a loser. Everyone wants to be strong, clever, successful, prosperous, upright, holy, etc. So those parts that make us seem weak, vulnerable, wrong, or unworthy get suppressed from our awareness, banished into hiding, as it were. In other words, the spirit of a human being can become fragmented, with some parts lost, missing, broken off, or suppressed. Everyone has experience of fragmentation, but the particulars are unique to each person. When the boy and his dog were separated on account of something said by an authority, the boy's spirit underwent a kind of fragmentation. But at first, he did not notice that his spirit was in some way broken. As the boy became an adult, a sense of interior emptiness, the brokenness, pushed, pulled, prodded him towards his spiritual space. To enter into his spiritual space was not so much a journey of the logical intellect, but rather an immersion into his sensing, feeling spirit. To do this, he adopted a posture of stillness, sitting at the edge of a forest, waiting. He did not know what exactly was going to happen. Practically speaking, he would have had to abandon his busy agenda for at least some time each day just to be still, waiting to experience whatever arose for him into his awareness. The story tells us that slowly he became aware of eyes, a nose, mud, burrs, scars, and so on. As the dog took shape and emerged from the forest, so too did the details of his own life. In other words, his own personal story began to take shape. But having been mute for so many long years, it took a long time before the banished part of his own spirit could find its voice and speak. And when it finally spoke, the story that it told was one of vulnerability, pain, despair, hunger, loneliness, fear. The natural spiritual movements of sensing and responding to the world had become progressively subdued and silent. The dog had become very weak and thin. To the casual observer, the boy had become a law-abiding, productive citizen, but when he really examined himself honestly, he was operating mostly by rote, by force of habit, like a programmed automaton. Like the boy's banished dog, his inner self had become weak and thin, banished, disconnected from his day-to-day operations. As he sat waiting by the edge of the forest, at the edge of his spiritual space, happy memories surfaced along with the difficult ones. There were the times when he had felt loved and held, when someone had helped him, when someone had shown him kindness or consideration. These were the life-giving moments that strengthened his spirit. These were the God moments where his very being was fed and nurtured. The Christian tradition has referred to these life-giving experiences as graced. By the power of God's grace, the life-giving experiences can subvert those that have hurt and hindered one's well-being. By subversion, we mean that those hurts that have silenced the spirit lose their power to do so. The fragmentation heals and new vitality arises. The child within the adult told his story and in so doing reawakened the love for his dog. In full possession of his soul, his life became somehow newly animated. He was flourishing despite the old experiences of fragmentation. He had undergone a reawakening of his spirit with an accompanying sense of well-being. Now, in this reflection, we have learned that spiritual space is where a self gets its sacred capacity to sense and to move towards well-being, to recollect who it has been, and to heal the broken parts. The spirit also animates the capacity to imagine and to choose the self's own becoming. In our science-driven world, we often make predictions about categories of persons who've undergone trauma and injustice, presuming that the future for them is restricted to nothing but more violence and injustice. If we look to the historical facts, we may be tempted to think that a tit-for-tat kind of symmetry describes our world, and that violence and destruction is the only certainty. We may be led to believe that moral behavior involves the sacrifice of self-annihilation, and the ultimate moral choice is opting for how and when to die. But the Christian spirit embraces a belief in life beyond the evident facts of violence and destruction. That belief gives rise to choices for ever-increasing vitality, especially in the very face of death. This is the ultimate power of the spiritual space of human being. On this view, the ultimate moral choice concerns not the mode of destruction, but the mode of being, of flourishing, of vitality everlasting. In its natural leaning toward the life-giving and its natural shunning of annihilation, the human spirit mysteriously passes through death to participate the resurrection of the body. The stronger the spiritual space, the more deeply sensed is the experience of passing through the annihilating fragmentations into a renewed sense of animation. Without movements in the spiritual space, the boy and his dog could not have embraced and started a new life together again. In concluding this reflection, I will offer another story, one that is taken from the Old Testament. Elijah the prophet was fleeing the armies of Jezebel, hiding himself in a cave, lamenting his fate, seeking the Lord. In this story, we discover a description of the quality or feeling sense in which an encounter with the sacred can take place within the human spiritual space. And God said, "Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord, and behold the Lord passing by. And a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still, small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" Human beings encounter the sacred through a posture of stillness. The spiritual space, when it participates the sacred, is not threatening, violent, thrashing, burning, roaring, etc. It is gentle, quiet, compassionate, and hospitable. It does not destroy. It shelters and nurtures, even and especially in the face of those forces of fragmentation that culminate in death. To get in touch with one's personal spiritual space is to immerse oneself into the sensing, feeling physicality of our being. It is to show up at the edge of an unknown place and wait quietly, without knowing exactly what to expect. To get in touch with one's spiritual space is not about enduring harsh, destructive punishments. It is to feel physically a sense of safety, compassion, renewed vitality washing over the self. The human spiritual space, when participating in the sacred, chooses life and animation with such intensity that ultimately even death itself can no longer negate that choice. So we return to our original questions. What do we mean by the human spirit? Who does my very own spirit look like? Where is the spiritual space? How can I get to know my unique spirit and its special space? We have explored the story of the boy who became separated from his beloved dog, but then years later was drawn to enter into his own emptiness. Empty and still, he waited until he could see all the lost parts of the dog, and he retrieved his love for the dog so that once again they could live together. Together, healed of the past, separated, they became more intensely alive, more truly unique. The old identity, characterized by destruction and suppression of the repugnant parts, was left behind. And we have seen that this spiritual space is entirely incarnate, felt and sensed in the faithfulness of its fears, joys, sorrows, and hopes. It is on the inside of the self, not an exterior power that punishes and banishes. The spiritual space is not an idea or an order or an obligation coming in from the outside of the self. It is not the thinking intellect. It is the sensing, feeling, material self that discovers deep within a capacity for compassion, the essence of the sacred. I invite you to comment, share your ideas. We'll start a conversation. Thank you for watching.